We're very excited here at the Open Contracting Partnership with our partners as Public and Spend Network to welcome you to this launch event of our new Open and Sustainable Public Procurement Guide, as well as hopefully a really insightful conversation into how to implement open and sustainable public procurement. We're, thank you so much for joining the conversation about implementing, this critical topic. We're excited to be here with partners, and I've sort of like started to recognize some of the names from people that we know and that we've worked with our partners, colleagues in governments, international organizations, and experts to really dig deeper into this key issue. Please take a moment to introduce yourselves in the chat, and we look forward to having your questions as we go along. So if we want to tackle the climate crisis and we want to have a greener, cleaner, and more sustainable and more resilient supply chains, governments will need to change and will need to buy things in a fundamentally different way. It's not a choice. Whether it's building back to recover from the impact of hurricanes or floods, or putting infrastructure in place to prevent disasters, it's a critical approach that we have to implement as we go forward. At Open Contracting Partnership, we work with over 50 countries, regions, and cities to open up and transform public procurement for a more sustainable, resilient, and inclusive world. For this research, we've talked to many of you, and one thing stood out. Sustainability is really one of the key and critical areas you are thinking of right now. So it's one of the areas that we've been investing in quite a bit. We've worked with Lithuania on measuring what they're buying, with Mexico City on improving their green bike share program, and through our Open Contracting Impact Accelerator LIFT program with countries such as Paraguay and Ekiti, Nigeria, to improve equity and inclusion through public procurement. We've also heard that while there are already a lot of helpful resources from many partners, from the World Bank, from the Inter-American Development Bank, more user-friendly and specific guidance and examples would really help you in your implementation journey. We know it can be really daunting to think about where to start with incorporating life cycle costing to buying more locally and sustainably. That's why we've developed this Open and Sustainable Public Procurement Guide together with Public and the Spend Network. It articulates our key new offering, designing and implementing procurement reforms that promote greater sustainability, especially environmental sustainability and resilience through the better use of open data, process, and technology. Done better and openly, public procurement could be a hidden lever. Done poorly or left unchanged, it will be a brake on environmental progress. Luckily, there's really some promising progress being made already. And I'm excited to hear more about that now from the partners that we've invited to contribute to the conversation, but also from our partners who will be introducing the toolkit. Let me start with handing it over to Damian Sarvanhu from the GIZ, who has been an amazing partner in developing this toolkit, but also, as I briefly mentioned to him before, since the start of the Open Contracting Partnership in 2012 in South Africa, where sort of like a group of smart thinkers kind of like joined to think how we can change and transform open contracting. And we've started with the idea of making things more open. And I think now we realize what is critical is really to thinking about making public procurement sustainability and taking on that challenge. So I'm handing over to you, Damian, for brief introductory remarks as well.
Thanks, George, and welcome everyone. Greetings from Bonn. The German Development Cooperation is guided by the principles of effective development cooperation and supports public procurement as part of its support to good financial governance. In a significant number of about 30 good financial governance projects, public procurement is strengthened in partner countries. The COVID-19 pandemic has put public procurement in the spotlight like never before. The world has seen how hospitals, cities, regions, and different parts of government compete against each other for limited resources, such as vital personal protective equipment and medicines. Abuse of emergency procedures for procurement has been widespread. These failures of public procurement are still costing lives and are hurting poor communities and underrepresented groups, such as women the most. Public procurement is the biggest marketplace on earth, though, accounting for $1 in every $3 spent by governments. This is some 30 trillion US dollars of spending every year in 2019, or 15% of the global GDP. As countries started to roll out recovery programs and invest in much needed economic redevelopment, it became clear that procurement rules needed updates and practitioners needed guidance on how they not only can make procurement more transparent and accountable, but also sustainable. The European Commission defines sustainable public procurement as a process by which public authorities seek to achieve the appropriate balance between the three pillars of sustainable development: economic, social, and environmental, when procuring goods, services, or works at all stages of the project. It means using public sector demands much more strategically and going beyond price as an award criterion. But most sustainable procurement initiatives still take place in higher income countries, and no comprehensive guidance on how governments can make their procurement more open, effective, and sustainable exists. This is the reason why we joined forces last year with the Open Contracting Partnership to develop a comprehensive guide on open contracting for sustainable recovery for procurement practitioners. This guide shows approaches how to diagnose, plan, implement, and monitor procurement policies and systems, and provide practical guidance on how to lead an open, effective, and sustainable recovery from COVID-19 and better prepare for future crises. The practical guide targets in-country practitioners, especially from procurement agencies, ministries of finance, and sector agencies. But it will also help for civil society leaders, journalists, and other stakeholders working on procurement. It is also aimed to support development practitioners and partners gain a better understanding of how to mainstream open contracting more effectively in relevant sector programs or projects. This guide is part of an extensive Recover Forward toolkit developed by the German Development Corporation together with relevant stakeholders in the International Development Cooperation to better able to develop and invest in economic systems with social and environmental sustainability at their heart. On behalf of the German Development Corporation, I would like to express our gratitude to OCP, their partners and experts involved in developing this comprehensive guide. And I'm certainly looking forward to the presentation of this guide and the experiences of sustainable public procurement from Lithuania and Uganda. Thank you all, and back to you.
Thank you so much, Damian, and thanks for your kind words. We've been working on this tool for so long, and we've been looking at it. So I'm really excited for later from our partner Public to really start introducing you a little bit how the toolkit is set up, and hear from you as we go through, and how much how useful it will going to be. So we'll hear first from Lede on introducing the different sections of the toolkit and a brief introduction of what we've heard from you and how we've addressed sort of like your comments. Then we will hear from Ian McGill at Spend Network on two very specific worked examples on how you can calculate critical areas of sustainable public procurement. And then we'll hear from our practitioners that we've invited and that we've worked with in the past from Lithuania, Kęstutis and Sophia from Uganda, from the Procurement Agency as well. And then we hopefully will have some opportunity to have a good conversation. So so that you start getting to know a bit better the tool, which is also now live at sustainable.open-contracting.org. I'm handing over to you later.
Thank you, Georg. So my name is Lede, and I work for Public, who, for those of you who don't know, It's a digital advisory firm that works with global governments around the world on the design and delivery of digital public services. We specialize in procurement and especially on sustainable procurement. And this is why I'm really excited to be here with my colleague Johnny from Public as well, presenting this open and sustainable public procurement toolkit that we've co-created. So as Georg was saying, what I wanted to do during this next 10 minutes is talk a bit about the process that we have followed in order to understand what needed to be created to support sustainable public procurement implementation, and also how that has informed the structure of our new toolkit. So from all what we've heard so far, it's clear that sustainable public procurement is increasingly a priority for governments around the world. However, it's also challenging to implement. So we wanted to make sure that whatever we created really fitted the needs of end users. So to do that, we went out and we spoke to over 30 procurement practitioners and experts across the world, so including countries in Africa, Latin America, and Europe, to understand what end users needed in order to start implementing sustainable procurement. Based on the insights that we gathered from those conversations, and I know we spoke to a lot of you in this call, want to thank you for all your insights, as they have really helped us shape this new toolkit. So based on all of that, we created this new toolkit, which I will show now. But first, I wanted to go through the 3 key things that we heard from users. So one of the key things that we heard is that users need help navigating existing guidance. So there's currently a lot of really good and useful resources out there, including case studies, but users normally find it quite hard to navigate and know how to implement it in a practical way. So we've tried to respond to this by including a lot of practical tools in the way we've designed the toolkit, but also signposts to existing resources that can be really helpful for users to apply. And the second thing that we heard is that users need guidance to be practical. So to do this, we've included sections focusing on specific sectors, and also ways to kind of measure and drive a specific sustainability goals, such as gender inclusion, as part of their toolkit. And the third final thing that we heard is that users wanted more dynamic tool that they could easily navigate. So most of the existing guidance is hosted in long PDF documents, which can be sometimes hard to navigate and fit to different needs. So we've created a new digital platform, which I will share now, and we hope that will meet all the different needs that we heard from our users. I think I'm sharing my screen now. So this is our new open and sustainable public procurement toolkit. As you can see, there's a lot of information in there, but we've designed it in a way that we hope is easier to navigate and fits the needs of different users. I will first go and talk a little bit about the overall structure of the toolkit. So there's 4 key sections in the toolkit. The first one being a bit of an introduction into what open and sustainable public procurement is. And that mainly means that we give a bit of an explanation of the different ways in which open contracting and open government approaches can help drive sustainable outcomes through procurement. And then we go into the 3 key sections of the toolkit. The first one, starting at more at a policy level, what are the different first steps that you should take in order to make sure that you prepare the best framework to then implement sustainable procurement in your specific procurement processes. And that is where we move to the second section, which is about implementation. So how do you embed sustainability in your procurement? And then thirdly, we go into how to use open data in order to drive a specific sustainability goals. So this includes, for example, carbon reduction or life cycle costing uptake. So I'm going to go through the first key sections and highlight what the structure of the section is and the key tools that we've created within it. So the first section looks into planning and setting up your strategy. So what we heard when we're talking to users is that there are users at different stages in their procurement process, sustainable public procurement journey. So that means that some of them are thinking about how to set up the best regulatory framework in order to help practitioners implement sustainable procurement, and others might have already started implementing sustainable procurement and need help with monitoring outcomes. So in this section, we focus on those first steps that you would take in order to facilitate implementation. So it goes from establishing an enabling environment and understanding how your regulatory framework allows you to implement sustainable public procurement, all the way to prioritizing certain procurement categories maybe, or specific sustainability goals, setting a framework for monitoring progress against these goals, building capabilities to implement, and then also communicating this strategy that you have put together to all stakeholders to make sure that you're open about your strategy and that you can be held accountable. And within this section, I want to highlight two of the key tools that we've created. And the first one is in relation with the enabling framework. So when we're talking to users, we heard a lot that one of the key concerns is whether practitioners are able to implement sustainable procurement within current regulations. And what we have done to facilitate this assessment is creating a practical, quick, user-friendly checklist that users can implement to assess their regulatory framework. And the main message that we want to share with this is that regardless of your regulatory framework, there are different ways in which you can embed sustainability in your procurement. So this is a way for us to show the different steps that you would go through quickly to understand how you might implement sustainable procurement within your environment. And then the second key tool that we've created within this section is regarding monitoring and evaluation. So when you are implementing sustainable public procurement, you can be trying to pursue loads of different goals. So that can be gender inclusion, SME inclusion in procurement, or reducing carbon emissions. And there are loads of different ways to measure that. So here we provide some sample ways to do that. So for example, take reducing carbon emissions. So imagine that is a key goal for you when you're implementing sustainable public procurement. One of the indicators that you could use in order to measure progress against that goal could be recording the share of tenders which reference CO2 emissions within the award criteria. So we give those different indicators that you might use to measure progress against these goals, which will probably change depending on your own context, but this provides you a useful framework for you to adapt it to whatever the needs of your context are. And then Ian, my colleague from Spent Network, will give more information on how we, in the third section, then go into specific ways in which you can record the data you need to measure progress against these goals. And then, so once you've planned and you've set up your strategy from a more policy level, then you would go into implementing sustainable procurement, which is essentially embedding sustainability in your procurement. So in this section, what we do is we go from we go through the different steps and the different ways in which you might think about sustainability through the life cycle of your procurement. So from considering sustainability when you're deciding what to procure, through to the different procurement methods that you might use to further sustainability goals through your procurement, and also how to engage with sustainable suppliers, how to evaluate those suppliers against sustainability criteria, and then finally how to monitor those sustainability outcomes through the contract implementation. So in this section, I won't go into detail into all of these, but just wanted to highlight, for example, one of the key things that we've heard from users is that one of the main things about implementing sustainable procurement is including sustainability criteria within to evaluate suppliers, and that's something that can be challenging. So here we provide a view of the different steps that you might take in order to do that effectively, but also give some case studies of the different ways that other countries have done it. So for example, we provide one in the Netherlands where they account for the supplier CO2 emissions as part of the evaluation of suppliers. And that is one of the ways in which you can implement sustainable procurement within evaluation. And another one from Chile, which actually refers more to a regulatory change in which they are trying to forward the goal of promoting gender inclusion through procurement by including award criteria to benefit women-owned enterprises. So as you can see, we, as well as providing the guidance, we highlight to useful case studies and resources that users might use. So these are the two first sections, which move from policy considerations through implementation of specific procurements. And my colleague Ian from Spent Network is now going to talk about how to use open data in order to measure progress in procurement towards a specific goals. And as well as these three sections, you can see at the end of their toolkit that we've got a resource directory, case study database, a guide to eco-labels, and also some specific sector guidance to implement sustainable procurement in specific procurement categories. So I think that's all for me, and I will pass on to my colleague Ian to talk about the third section.
Thank you, Leda. Let me see if I can now share my screen. That should bring us up. Can everyone confirm that the right thing is being seen? Yes, thank you.
Looks
right.
Great.
Thank you so much, Ian.
It's always worth checking. Right. So thank you, Leda, and for that sort of very fulsome but really precise coverage of all the work that's been done to structure this. What I'm going to do is talk a little bit about how we go into the real nitty-gritty of calculating some examples of how we might calculate sustainable procurement using different tools. And there are a couple of things to mention here. I will be going through I'm just going to cover two things, carbon reduction and life cycle costing, but they're not the only thing. So we've done stuff on gender inclusion, economic development, and general uptake of sustainable procurement. But one of the things that we were very keen on from the start of this was to understand that not everyone has access to huge databases in the cloud, and that different people are going to require different skills or have different access to different skills and resources, but so that this guidance needs to cover how to do this regardless of where you are on that chain of both resource and skills. So we covered off something I'm looking at here in options for data use. Throughout this guidance, we've got three assessments of where you might be with the ability to write code. So we've got no code, low code, and code. And everything that we do is seen through that lens. So we make we provide different sets of advice depending on where you are. And really that is, it should allow you to understand, well, actually, if I'm limited in my capabilities to set up databases, that doesn't mean I can't use Excel sheets and look at the data and look at producing something insightful still with limited resources. So I just wanted to cover that off. Let me go through two things first. I'm going to go to life cycle costing first, and then the one that I know that everyone wants to talk about is carbon reduction, but they dovetail together quite nicely. So life cycle costing is something that actually is used quite a lot in construction and materials procurement, which is basically allowing, setting up a valuation of the use of an asset, not just the purchase of an asset, but the entire use of an asset, so that you can understand its natural cost over its lifespan, or the total cost of ownership. Now that actually extends out to a life cycle costing of carbon. So you can look at the total cost of carbon, and I'll come on to that later. But if we just talk about the practice of looking at the total cost of something, one of the examples we use in here is about laptops. And you might find that actually, for example, a cheap laptop is effectively a false economy because they keep breaking, or that you have to provide large amounts of support in order to make it work, and the IT team have to spend much more time supporting these products. So by taking a whole life cycle value and trying to work out the life cycle cost of that asset, you can derive a much better understanding of the impact of the purchase you're making. And that really applies not just to the monetary value, but also things like economic value. What we do in the core in this guide is we set out key areas that you would look at: initial investment, maintenance, licensing, staffings, etc. And throughout the guide, what we do is we give you these little boxes where we give you a live working example of how to understand different examples of costing and how to project those costings. So here we're looking at inflation and how that impacts a price, and then how to measure it over time. And throughout the guide, I won't go into all of these, as I'm sure you can understand, we sit and work and show you exactly how to get started with the maths. We're not talking about setting up Excel spreadsheets where you don't understand the algorithms. It's very clearly step-by-step laid out so that everyone can understand what things they need to do this work. We also talk about how you might gather the data, so the key bits of information, and this is the same for every case study. And we do this, and then finally we look at different options that you might want to look at, the goals that you can look at in each case. It's worth mentioning that we do have a section on life cycle costing and an SPP, and here we go. We've got carbon emissions associated with construction or with an electric car, with construction of a diesel car or an electric car. And you can work out roughly how you would do a life cycle costing on a purchase of two different types of asset. So that's the life cycle costing. Let me very quickly then go on to carbon reduction. One other thing I should mention is that throughout this work, we've been able to apply all of these algorithms to OCDS data. It may be OCDS data with an additional piece of information, such as number of employees at a company, or the details about the company, or gender pay gap data. But actually, this is all worked backwards from real examples. So we know that we can do this, and these are valid analysis that you can do with open contracting data. So what we're going to do is very quickly, here's how to estimate carbon values, some guidance, and then we can look at different ways. So is to look at CO carbon yields for different contracts, and this is how to estimate it. And then we might look at benchmarking. So you would look at saying, well, look, actually, if I've got a $5 million taxi contract, we can take that, the work that Leto was talking about different companies reporting yearly emissions to perform the contract, and then working that through in your evaluation. So this, not only are you able to use this in terms of, like, oh, this is the reporting I'm going to do after my contracts have been let, you can use this stuff as part of your specification and as part of your evaluation on a bid. You can see below some analysis that we've been doing in the UK, just using open data and applying different levels, adding carbon information, so that you can then do something like estimating the carbon values for contracts. And this can be used to estimate how carbon would be reduced over time if different sources of supply were being used. So there's different ways to look at this. What we've done is that we've looked at some sample indicators, and you can see that there's a range of goals here that we would want to look at, about how you would go through and then estimate how you would want to use those goals. It all links back to the public team's amazing work as well, their M&E framework, and it really does give you a very rounded and detailed view of how to tackle what is quite a difficult problem. I will just follow up, but as saying before, there's guidance on how you need to gather the data and the sort of data you need, and then how you can go about analyzing and reporting that data. So I think that's it from me. I hope I've been in time, Georg.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Ian. I think this was super insightful. I think one of the key things that we've heard from the community is really that, there are people who have, standardized open data, and all of the information is already in transactional databases. But, there's a lot of countries out there, and cities, and just different agencies who, who are thinking about, like, what is the best way to set up and track that information. The information is not yet available. So I think we thought, we were very thoughtful about, like, how do we address that, and coming up with solutions that allows you to open up a simple spreadsheet and start tracking some of that information, as much as whether you're having like a fully developed e-procurement systems. And I think that is something that we're looking forward to supporting partners throughout our sustainability program as well. And as we think about, like, how can we translate that and link that up to public procurement information. So thank you, ladies. Thank you, Ian. This has been really fascinating. I'm always excited by actually, having worked on the tool for quite a long time, and coming in sort of towards the end tail as a comms person. I'm always surprised, like, just how much information, how much tools, and how much kind of like how accessible the information is now. What I do want to do now is I want to hear a little bit from countries to share us their perspective of some of the partners that we've worked with. So what I wanted to start with is to hear from Sofia Masagasi, who leads on sustainable public procurement at the PP. At the Public Procurement Agency in Uganda. Sophia, if you are here, I'd love for you, if you have your video back on, that would be amazing. Tell us a little bit more about what you've done to kind of like set up the right legislation that addresses sustainable public procurement, and how you've started to integrate environmental safeguards into this information, and how you think you're going to use this. So I'm handing over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, in the Ugandan context, what I can say, what we've done in Uganda is to have the national procurement policy. We have a national procurement policy that supports sustainable public procurement. What it does is that it advocates for the use of public procurement as a tool for socio-economic development. And in that, it, of course, advocates for it to be, for public procurement to be carried out in a sustainable manner. And this has trickled down into the public procurement law, the Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Assets Act 2003. We have in Uganda an act that was enacted in 2003, but it has gone through several amendments. And one of the amendments that it has recently gone through, very recently, was in 2021, in which sustainable public procurement was included under section .
I think
Oh no.
I'm sure she'll be back in just a second. There she is back.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, you're back. If you think your internet is a little bit unstable, please feel free to switch off the camera.
Okay, maybe I'll switch off the camera. Sorry about that.
No worries. Thank you.
Yes, so I was saying that we have a Public Procurement Act that has gone through a couple of amendments, and the most recent one was in 2021, in which a new section was added to the Act under section 61A and 59B. The Public Procurement Act provides for sustainable public procurement. Its implementation will subsequently be integrated into the standard bidding documents that are used by procuring and disposing entities. We've had several trainings for both government officers and providers in the implementation of sustainable public procurement. We've also worked with different partners in trying to put in place an action plan. And an action plan has been generated looking at strengthening the existing legal framework, in addition to including the sustainable public procurement provisions in the Act and regulations. We are looking at developing guidelines and manuals, and this tool will come in really helpful, the tool that you've developed. Of course, in looking at especially the monitoring aspects, because the action plan is also looking at monitoring the implementation of this sustainable public procurement in the government institutions. We've also had an amendment in the standard bidding documents to include environmental, social health, and safety aspects in public procurement. And this includes both social aspects, social safeguards, and environmental requirements. A priority will be given to goods that have been identified as environmentally friendly, from providers, of course, who shall be certified and considered to be socially, to be environmentally, responsive. We have also, in the amended Act, included provisions on preferential treatment and reservation for not just local providers, but also targeted groups. The specific targeted groups we are looking at here are women, youth, and persons with disabilities. And we've been working with partners, including UN Women and some commercial banks, which have been trying to build the capacity of women to participate in public procurement. Several reservation schemes have been put in place, and we think that this shall go even further to improve on the implementation of sustainable public procurement. Preference, of course, is intended to be given to goods that use more resource and energy efficient technologies in their manufacturing, and those that limit pollution to the environment. I wouldn't say that results are yet evident, because these, like I said, have been introduced from the amendment in the law in 2021, and so we're still in the early stages of getting this implementation and getting the action plan, implemented and ready to and moving on. But in the laws, it's there. In the standard bidding documents, we now have these provisions for environmental, social health, and safety requirements that suppliers are required to satisfy when they're providing goods and services to procuring and disposing entities from government. So that's where we are for now.
Sorry for this. No, thank you so much, Sophia. I think you've done a really good job of setting yourself up with sort of like looking at the sustainability in a very comprehensive way, both from sort of like some of the key documents in the public procurement process, such as standard bidding documents, as well as the regulation, but also thinking about like how you can integrate and monitor suppliers. So I think we're really excited about sort of like how Uganda kind of like looked at the different elements and set yourselves up. And I think it's a great model for other countries as well, sort of like thinking about like what are the different elements in implementing open and sustainable public procurement, and sort of like starting to work on these. I think the challenge will be, as you say, sort of like slowly making that progress and starting implementing it and monitoring it. So I'm really excited to have Kęstutis Kasiulis from the procurement agency in Lithuania to share a little bit more about, like, you know, how you've gone about actually tracking and trying to sort of like monitor this from the data perspective as well. So handing it over to you, Kęstutis, and looking forward to hearing from you.
Hello, everyone. You know, it's a pleasure to be here. And, you know, as I saw, I think it was Lindsay's daughter coming to her. It's very important to understand why we are doing this. You know, it's for the next generation and the generation after ours. So, hello, everyone. My name is Kęstutis Kasiulis. I work in the public procurement office in the Republic of Lithuania. And I'll try to be brief on our work which we are doing with data in transforming our public procurement system in general towards more sustainability. You know, as briefly in legal situation, we had the government resolution which said that from now on we have to change everything, and it must be more sustainable. Then the Minister of Environment made an order for criteria of green public procurement, which has 34 different categories of goods and services. And I just you know, don't want to get into details, but we had another law of alternative fuels, and the Energy Ministry has energy efficiency requirements for the public procurements. And here's our organization, which is responsible for implementing the requirements, and we consult every purchasing body for how to put it into public procurements, and also monitoring all public procurement system in the whole country. So the resolution of government until 2020 was that only some group of products are obliged of green public procurement requirements. But from 2021, from actually 1st of July, it was mandatory that all 10% from all public money, public procurements money, must be spent on the green public procurements. This year's criteria is 50%, and from the next year, it must be all public procurement must be put as green. So it means it has to have some green criteria. So how we've done back in the days was like only the first is for value, because the law says that we have to be measuring it according to value, but also for us as the controlling organization is very important to see the number of public procurements from the whole, how many public procurements are done in a green way. So in 2022, as I checked the data from I think last Friday, it is now 45.8% of the green public procurement. So hopefully we will reach the goal by the end of the year. So how we compare and measure it? So we had a public procurement dashboard, which is based on the data which is open in our country for all contracts. And those contracts and also reports are being combined, and it's a live dashboard. It means every 24 hours it refreshes. So we have all the possibilities of checking, from the if we're interested in the sector, which sector is buying green, which is lacking of the buying green, also purchasing bodies, purchasing objects, it's either goods, services, or works, procedure types, open, simplified, etc. And we can identify any separate public procurement and look into it specifically if we are interested as a purchasing body, what criteria was used. So here's like just general sample of all the ministries in Lithuania, and it was rated, some of them are red and they see that they are not meeting the criteria, some of them green, so they know that they met the criteria by the time. So also what we gain from opening data and showing it. So the biggest advantage is the increased competition, not only in suppliers competition as such, but also if you see, the ministries, and I'm the minister, and I saw and I see that my ministry is standing behind other ministries. So as a, minister, I am concentrated in increasing my job to meet the criteria. Also in municipalities, in the purchasing bodies, it's in the good way also increase competition, because you don't want to be the last one on the list. So we spotted this, and as soon as we started that dashboard, and we started presenting for the different parts of government, the amount of green public procurement increased drastically. So we saw that in the good way. Also, we see that open data enabled us to increase the competence of purchasing bodies, because they can see the examples how to do the green public procurement. And also we saw the lack of knowledge in certain sectors. So we can provide the methodology help for direct sector, which are lacking behind. For us, for example, we saw from the data that education system is lacking the knowledge of doing green public procurement. So we made through the science ministry that we will do the methodology help for them. So we do the conference only for the education sector, to what's the problem, what the problems are facing, and what is the biggest challenges. So we, by knowing that, we could direct our focus to the struggling sector. So what is more, it's informed society. By opening data, we show that we direct public money to achieve certain goals as a country. For example, to achieve the green goals, to achieve the European Union goals of the Green Deal. And also, what is more important, that the people, the society can see what country spends on and how much they are paying for certain goods or services. Also very important, we saw that it's decreasing year by year, decreasing of speculation, because like not far ago, like 3 years ago, it was enough, one publication of speculation that public procurement is doing nothing, or it's misspend the money also. So what open data of that contract of our dashboard show exactly, and you can immediately check the information if it's correct, or if it's misleading, or it's manipulation, or it prevents political manipulation as well. So all those of opening data, we see the advantages. Going further, we have some obstacles as well, and we want to improve the system as such, because You know, as also Ian mentioned, carbon emissions measuring in and incorporating into public procurement is one of our agenda. But the biggest obstacle is, you know, lack of a universal system. Because if we want to measure and compare something, we need to have we need to be on the level play field. We can ask one runner to go up the hill and measure his time instead of, you know, another running downhill and say that, okay, it's comparable. So also with the social agenda, social public procurements, which, you know, now we are creating criteria and it must start by the beginning of the next year. So how we will compare it. So the biggest challenge is that it should be measurable, comparable, and the most important thing that it must be validated. Because otherwise it will be, they say, we say, and we will go nowhere. And it will, in the end of the day, we'll have a lot of conflicts among the entities, and it won't solve anything. So, and the second most important thing is data accessibility. If we can have open data and we can access it, we can compare everything. Yeah. So in social, going forwards for social criteria, the most important thing is to measure, you know, and the biggest debate nowadays is what is privacy and what it can be open, you know, and the challenge is that we want to do some good things with the public money, but on the other hand, we say that it's privacy which prevents us. So the solution, to my opinion, should be like, don't have certain data, but as I think Ian mentioned earlier, that certain company has, you know, the ratio of women versus men, and the gap of salaries between men and women. So it should be opened without the names, without the surnames, but that data, if we want to do an impact as a social society, which that should be accessible. So I think one of the other issues is to open it, and to open it in the safe way. And as I think it was mentioned also earlier, that it should be through different countries to be interpreted in the same way, or to present it in the same way, that it would be easier to compare it in like certain entity. If we want foreigners to participate in our public tender, we must have their data, and we should be enabled to compare it with a certain company of Lithuania. Then in that way we can hope for achieving some transformation and moving forward towards more sustainability.
Thank you, Kęstutis. This was really, really insightful in terms of, like, you know, looking at how you've been implementing this. Very, very fascinating. I think some of my colleagues have heard this before. I hadn't, so I'm very grateful for you to sort of like present in very detailed sort of like the different elements. There have been already a couple of questions, and really good questions, that we've been starting to respond in the chat as well. So please, as you sort of like think about kind of like your own challenges that you've been having, and you know, you as a government have been facing, you know, how you know, we'd love to hear them and continue responding them through the chat, and some of them I'll pick up for this conversation and brief discussion that I want to have now with the participants. I think I've seen that you know, we've had a conversation around actually measuring and making sure that we're not sort of like incentivizing greenwashing, but we're thinking about, like, you know, actually measuring CO2 emissions. I think there's a similar issue with zero carbon pledges or race to zero, where it's about, you know, what is the best sort of like standardized format, how voluntary versus non-voluntary some of those reportings actually should be. Thanks for for the comments already there. There's also a question on sort of like what's our recommendation for governments that don't have, for example, a National Procurement Act, or that don't have sort of like appropriate legislation. Later, do you want to briefly mention sort of like some of the steps from the tool guide on like how, where to start with legislation? Because obviously, sometimes, like creating a new law can be a very lengthy process, but there might be other ways of starting to think about, creating guidelines and other elements.
Yeah, of course. I think that's a really good question. And I think, as I said, is one of the key concerns regarding regulation, that you are not able to start implementing sustainable procurement as a practitioner unless there's like a specific regulatory framework and action plan done by your government. However, one of the key things that you can look at is within current regulation, how you can start implementing sustainable procurement. So for example, in a lot of countries, the issue is that you are only allowed to award a bid to the lowest price bid. So this makes a lot of procurement practitioners think that they cannot include sustainability criteria, but what you can do there is include sustainability criteria, for example, within the technical specifications. And to guide that process, what you can do is engage, as I think Ian has already mentioned as part of his answer, is maybe engage with the suppliers of the specific category you're procuring. So understand what certifications are already available. So if there's a specific, for example, environmental label attached to computers, which there are many, you can maybe look at those specifications and use them to draft your technical specifications, and that will be allowed as long as it's tied to the subject matter of the contract, which if you're procuring a computer, if it's tied to that, it will be allowed, and you don't need a regulation specifically to allow for that. Another thing that you can also do is start thinking about cost in terms of life cycle costing. So again, even if it's just awarding based on lowest price bid, if you consider the different costs associated to that procurement, so from manufacturing to like sourcing some material and like waste management of that computer, for example, then it is probably likely that you will end up procuring something that's more sustainable, as normally the costs associated to least sustainable options are higher in terms of maintenance, and you normally have to change the product more often. So I think looking at current certifications used by specific industries, and also conducting life cycle costing approaches to costing of your bid is one way to do that within current regulation that might be a bit more strict. And I think throughout all of this, engaging just with suppliers. So we've got a whole section on supplier engagement, and I think engaging with the suppliers related to the tender that you're about to put out, I think it's a great way to talk to the market and understand what are different ways of doing that in a more sustainable way, and then use that as guidance to draft your procurement.
Thank you so much, Leyden. I think that really captures this as well. And I think sort of like thinking about priority sectors as well. And I think, the toolkit, we've identified obviously construction as one of the key priority sectors. And I think, we might have mentioned it before, but public procurement and the stuff that governments buy, just contributes to about 15% of global carbon emissions. So there's a huge impact there when you think about those high impact industries such as construction, and starting there would be a great opportunity, or starting in the ICT sector as well, where it's often about how do you create and use the energy that you have. There's two more. There were quite a number of conversations and questions in the chat so far around expanding and understanding the definition for sort of like sustainable public procurement, and like how do you make sure that other ministries such as the labor ministry, or the ministries that work on like improving SME participation, are also aware of public procurement as a strategic tool to really address their goals. And I think that is something that we're addressing in the toolkit as well. So thanks for raising that question. And from Kęstuty's presentation, we've seen the impact on competition and increasing competition thanks to reaching out to new actors and creating those extra additional elements and criteria that support potentially more local or more smaller businesses that normally don't have the chance to participate in public procurement. So thank you for those questions. One of the things that I wanted to ask a little bit the panel about is, we talk not only about sustainable public procurement, but as open contracting partnership, we're also seeing that sustainable procurement can be significantly powered by openness. And I think one of the, we've heard a little bit about open data, but we're also thinking that open goes beyond just the data. It's also about open processes, open consultations, open policies, and openly reporting on the impact that you're achieving. So I think we think that is sort of like a key element that can really empower your sustainable public procurement conversations. I wanted to sort of like briefly ask Ian, and then later, and then maybe from Sophie and Kestutis to sort of like briefly reflect on that question of sort of like, or provide an example like how open approaches can be implemented in practice and how they can really power up sustainable public procurement beyond sort of like in addition.
If I just a real example that we worked on in South Africa was the bringing together of their database on ownership of companies. So the nature, whether the gender of the race of company owners, and then bringing that into public procurement. And so what we were in that was fantastically enabled by both data sets being inherently committed towards openness. So the ability from one institution that holds this data to work with another institution that holds this data would have been an absolute nightmare if it was licensed, because they said, oh, well, you can't buy this, you can't do this, you can't publish that. But because it was open, we were able to make much more progress. Now, is as much of it open as we would all like? Probably not. But it allowed us to set the baseline for working. And so I think the vision we all have here is to be able to report on activities across multiple organizations. And if those multiple organizations have an underpinning of openness and an agreement that they're going to share data and share information, just like we did on this project, all three of us working together, we were like able to go, oh yeah, well, let's get this done. And I think that's so important to keeping your eyes on the goal. Like Kestutis said, is we're doing this for future generations. And openness is just the road down which we travel to get there. But the goal, it makes it so much easier to transact. Does that help? Am I in the right?
No, absolutely. And I think you highlight a critical issue. And I think as we're talking about sustainable public procurement, and as we're seeing a little bit in the chat, it's sort of like starting to link up different data sets across not only just like, supplier data and, your tender information that you have in your own systems, but you have to think about like, how can I integrate additional information to actually track more smartly whether the investments are actually having impact? So I think in what you're saying and what you've done, for example, with the gender gap pay analysis in the UK, you've been able to, where you've looked at how where does government money go, and does it go to companies, and how fairly are they paying their employees? And you were able to like pull the information on the companies themselves that was available, right? But if that information wouldn't be available, and in most of the countries it is not available, you can't do that analysis. So it's a really useful important element. So thanks for that, Ian. Maybe you want to sort of like link into the report as well on gender gap pay, which we highlight in the conversation. Later, do you want to talk about maybe some of the open approaches and progress approaches?
Yeah, so I think obviously open contracting data essential to measure progress against sustainability goals that you're trying to reach with your sustainable public procurement strategy, but also, as we were saying before, the open government approach is also essential when it comes with working with different stakeholders. So implementing sustainable public procurement is new for all of us. And I think this is where having an open government approach and so reaching to suppliers and working with suppliers in order to understand what the market is doing in certain areas and translating that into feedback for your procurement processes is also really important. I think we've highlighted a few examples of this in our toolkit. So there's one, for example, which Open Contracting Partnership worked with in Mexico CC. So Ecobici is like a bike sharing system, and the whole success of the procurement was due to their engagement with their supplier market and the users, the end users of that bike sharing system, that really made it more successful and sustainable. And there's also a lot of examples regarding to how open government practices can help with monitoring activities. So for example, there is an example in Peru of like a monitoring system for construction projects. So what they try to do is engage citizens in the monitoring of big construction and infrastructure projects, so they can voluntarily visit, they get trained and they can visit construction sites to, for example, monitor whether health and safety measures are being taken into account, whether any waste has been left over after the project has ended. So things like that, that by having a more open approach to contracting, you can get the feedback you need and also engage their different stakeholders in the process, so it's the most successful it can be.
Thanks, Leila. I think that's a really important consideration to think about, like how do you engage with the different stakeholders and what are the kind of participatory mechanisms that you integrate, because it's sometimes hard to understand how do you there have been a question of like how do you know that suppliers will self-report their CO2 emissions, carbon emissions correctly, right? So like knowing the challenges from the suppliers themselves in this process will be really helpful as you go through this. I think the IDB, someone is joining, like they will have a self-assessment tool for sustainable procurement that they will be launching soon. So if you want to drop in that that invitation to the event this week, please do so. Kęstutis, do you want to briefly talk about the value of open? I think you've talked briefly about it in your conversation and presentation, but if you have any additional points, that would be great.
So, I think I tried to cover as much, the advantages of openness. And going forwards, that is for us the biggest challenge, to open the data or the like from the social point of view, to indicate the inequality or those people which in the disadvantaged situation, that the government's money or taxpayers' money could be devoted to change, to have an impact, on that socially disadvantaged people, to have a change in that way. So I think if we get that data opened, we can make a comparison or we can measure it, because otherwise we just get, the suppliers which says that we will make a change, but it's very hard to prove that with no data. So yeah, that data is the biggest, challenge for nowadays. And as the example, we can now I can say that we are now in changing of our approach to e-procurement system, as now, because we have quite a significant data on green public procurement. So we are now from the next, and the new system starts in the end of the next year. So from 2024, we are evaluating as a risk, not making a green public procurement. So it will be a separate risk even for that. So that what data is, open data is enabling us.
Awesome, thank you so much, Kęstutis. Sophia, I think you dropped off for a moment, but you're back. Do you want to briefly comment on this? If not, what I would like to do is yes, wonderful. Would you like to comment briefly on the sort of like how you're seeing the element of openness powering up your sustainable public procurement work?
Okay, thank you. What we've done in Uganda is we are using the government procurement portal as
Sorry, Sophia, I just switched off, I think, your video. Hopefully with that, your internet connection comes back.
Also, sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah, you're back. I think it's really the video connection. Thank you.
Let me take off the
No worries.
video. I'm so sorry. Yes, what we've done now is also to involve in to have electronic government procurement. What that does is that everything is submitted electronically, and so the electronic government procurement gives an opportunity for more openness in the procurement process. Basically, the manual process was more not as open as the electronic procurement is able to. The amount of data that is able to be out there, available to be analyzed, is much more than it was in the manual system. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you so much. And I think one of the elements that you've highlighted before in terms of like the standard bidding documents, those are sort of like critical elements that that include that information as well. So we're getting very close to sort of like the final round. So I see still a couple of questions that maybe my colleagues will be able to respond in the chat or respond in the chat. What I wanted to do is sort of like just a round of our sort of like specific panel to let everyone know, like, what is the one thing participants here in the panel should do now, basically. The one thing, if you'd have one thing, sort of like, to really implement open sustainable public procurement, here's my recommendation. Who wants to start? Maybe we start with Damian.
Well, thanks, George. I would recommend to use the tool, certainly, and I'm already really happy that there was some questions about whether it will be translated into other languages. So I will perhaps also with you and representatives from the Open Contracting Partnership look more deeply into this.
Wonderful, thank you, Damian. Lede, what's your one recommendation beyond using the tool? Obviously, as an author.
I think for anyone that's working in a specific procurement, I think it's mainly just a start. I think a lot of the guidance that is out there normally, and including ours, we do, it's obviously great to start like preparing for it and having a policy and like an action plan, but I think it's also really important to just, whenever if you're dealing with a specific procurement, just think about just do some research in terms of how you can make that more sustainable, and you don't really need to wait for all of the other things to be set up. You can start thinking about it yourself and start talking to your suppliers. I think that's probably my main recommendation.
Start talking to suppliers. I think that's a great one. Ian, what's your one recommendation?
So I'd look at your pipeline. We know that you're going to be, right now, you're looking at contracts that are expiring in 12 months' time. So the most important thing is to not worry about the contract you've just let, but to worry about the contract that you're most likely to be working on in the next 6 months. Look at your pipeline, look at the contracts that you're going to be reletting, and highlight those with the highest carbon intensity, and then use that to guide which suppliers you're going to speak to. So Lede's advice with a bit of pipeline analysis should see you through.
Love it, Ian. I think sort of like looking forward and start with the biggest fish. I think that's a great advice. Kestutis, what's your advice?
To set up some, achievable goals and moving towards that, but it's very, very important that it should be measurable. Otherwise, if you don't base on data, it will be only abstract. So I think if you want to set up goals, first you think how to achieve them by proving it with all available data. So my advice would be just simple like that.
Measurable goals, and we have a couple of M&E goals as part of the toolkit. I thought your other advice would be talk to Carolis and get some support, which we're obviously also looking forward to do. And Sophia, if you would like to share your one point of advice.
Thank you. My one would be to get priority products and services. So have priority products that you're focusing on trying to make more sustainable for governments that are procuring.
Yeah, I love that advice. It's really sort of like the big, it sometimes, and we've seen this a lot, like thinking about implementing sustainable public procurement really feels like, you have to eat all the elephant at once, but you want to start with chopping it up a little bit and start with something, pilot it, show that it works, and then you can scale it. Thank you so much for Sophia. That's some great advice. I think with this, we're coming to a close of really a fascinating conversation. I'm sure it's, and we know it's just the start of a conversation, and we're hoping that the toolkit really provides you with a good starting point on where to go. If you're wondering sort of like what to do, we're, as Open Contracting Partnership, going forward, we're bringing the open contracting approach to sustainable public procurement, and that will be a key focus of our work at OCP. It's about better data and more participation that are the critical components that we envision as part of a more resilient, sustainable, and really inclusive world. So we look forward to kicking off this work, supporting many of you and the partners and countries that joined us today. Thank you so much, Ian. Thank you, Leire. Thank you, Sophia. Thank you, Kestutis. Thank you, Damian. Fascinating conversation. And, this is a hopefully great toolkit at a critical time. And we look forward to working together and catalyzing your reform efforts as we build sort of like more open and sustainable public procurement. Thank you so much, everyone. We're in touch, and we look forward on continuing this conversation.